So I was watching Moderate Rebels just recently, and Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton and Ali Abunimah from the Electronic Intifada were talking about how in France there's a whole sort of increase in oppressive levels towards the French Muslim community. And Emmanuel Macron has used the recent terrorist incident where somebody who was actually not part of the French community but came from outside, I can't remember his name, but he decapitated a teacher who had warned his students that he was going to show some cartoons that were offensive to the Prophet Muhammad and to Muslims, and he gave children the opportunity to leave the room before he showed these other children. But unfortunately, it's a story that you can look up. But anyhow, it wound up in tragedy. And the person, I won't say he's Muslim because that is sort of something that most Muslims would condemn, that sort of violent action. But he ended up being killed. But anyway, Emmanuel Macron is using that incident of that decapitation of that French teacher as an excuse to bring about some draconian measures on French Muslims, which is really like things like having to get a license to be able to preach Islam in France, that kind of thing. And basically it has to be state-sanctioned Islam. And there are other things as well. They have to, and basically if they don't comply with this, then charities and even an organization which is against Islamophobia, which is addressing Islamophobia, all of these organizations are going to be threatened in some way, whether financial ruin or something like that. Can you imagine them doing this to, say, Catholics or any other group? This is the only group that France, Emmanuel Macron is doing to. This is the only group that he's targeting, basically. So here we go again. And if you've ever heard that saying, if you think that there's racism in the UK, you haven't been to France. And unfortunately, that's the case. And when it comes to Muslims, or particularly black Muslims, black people in general, it's really they're often treated like second-class citizens. But this I'm going to play something from this Moderate Rebels thing, which is really quite frightening, because Ali Abunimah says that basically all these different this Islamophobic industry that is funded often by dark money in the United States, they'd be clapping their hands at these kind of oppressive measures against French Muslims. So what's going on in France, and there are other things too, where contempt of a public official, that's a name of a law now, I think. There's been thousands of people actually have been prosecuted under this law, contempt of a public official. And an example of that is, say, burning an effigy of Emmanuel Macron, that sort of thing. And also it's going to be seen as a crime to film police. And they're really cracking down on the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes. They've been doing that now, and you really don't hear anything much about the gilets jaunes, even though that's an ongoing thing, the yellow vests, protests and all of that against neoliberalism. Macron seems to have just doubled down on his oppressiveness, basically, of the gilets jaunes, rather than doing something, about social inequality and about these dreadful neoliberal policies. No, he's doubling down on that. And this is like just like the I talked about before, the anti-Semitism, the bogus definition of anti-Semitism is going to be used to oppress and ban and block anti-imperialists who are consistent, who, if you're an anti-imperialist, you should be against the oppression of Palestinians in the apartheid state of Israel. And France is making sure that people who, I think that France is going to be like a pilot test case that the US is going to use, where they're going to use bogus definitions, just like in the UK, where they've tried to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn under bogus definitions of anti-Semitism, where you basically are called an anti-Semite if you are speaking out against the apartheid state of Israel. And they're going to use that for any consistent anti-imperialist who will be against, sort of against the apartheid state of Israel, and probably for BDS, the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions Program. They're going to expand this definition so that if you are for Palestinian rights, then it's going to be against the law almost or it's going to be something you're going to be penalized for if you are against NATO or imperialist wars, because they'll manage to kind of glom it all together. So this is very disturbing, and I've talked about that in an earlier video. But this one that Macron is doing in France towards the French Muslim community, and basically going to penalize and punish, sort of an anti-Islamophobic organization, and also other Islam charities, if they don't comply to this basically state-sanctioned, sort of Islam, basically Macron and the state deciding who can preach Islam. I mean, it's just outrageous. And as Ali Abunimah said, Napoleon did something similar to the Jews, and this is sort of a repeat of that, except it's against Muslims. So anyway, this is an interesting take, interesting little excerpt, and something that will probably be, sort of taken on in other countries if it's successful in France. These are all just pilot cases, test pilot cases, so that other countries can adopt them. And I find oftentimes what happens in the United States ends up happening here in Australia eventually. These unfortunate and corrupt neoliberal warmongering politicians often just take a leaf out of the book of their counterparts.
Fascistic Jewish nationalist groups were intimidating universities against hosting me, and it was just, I felt like I was experiencing some level of the repression that French Muslims experience on a much more daily basis. And under Macron, the repression has intensified, and Palestine solidarity activism is being actively criminalized in France. But as you both mentioned, it's really sort of a test case for expanding a kind of emergency law using the most vulnerable groups as a pilot program. Ali, you've written about France. You've been following it most of your life. What's happening there, and why is it so concerning?
Yeah, there's so much happening in France, and it's shocking how little attention it's getting. I mean, it's getting some attention, but compared to this, alarm bells should be ringing everywhere about what's happening in France, because if that is what's coming in the other so-called Western democracies, we are truly, that's where the real fascist threat is, much more than Donald Trump. I think the real fascist threat comes dressed in liberal, in liberal tones. And there's a couple of things happening in France. In France, like other countries, has been prosecuting BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions activists for years. These are Palestine solidarity activists. And in June, there was a landmark decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which overturned the convictions of a bunch of activists who had called on shoppers not to buy Israeli goods. And it said these criminal convictions in France violated their fundamental right to freedom of expression and freedom of association that is enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, it emerged that the French government has decided, that France is bound by these precedents, but basically the French Justice Ministry has decided to ignore this precedent-setting ruling and has ordered prosecutors to double down on prosecuting Palestine solidarity activists in France, completely ignoring this ruling. But this is happening against the backdrop of a much bigger and more frightening repression in France, which goes far beyond Palestine solidarity. And there have been a couple of reports recently from Amnesty International, one in September and then a more recent statement. The one in September found that in 2018 and 2019, more than 40,000 people in France had been convicted under vague laws which criminalize so-called contempt of a public official. And many of them were protesters, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protesters, who were protesting against the neoliberal policies of Emmanuel Macron. And France is every year taking tens of thousands of people to court to criminally prosecute them basically for protesting. And one of the convictions cited by Amnesty International was for two men who were convicted for burning an effigy of Emmanuel Macron during a protest. So that is an example of contempt of a public official. And the irony is that France is also waging a war against its French Muslim population under the banner of supporting free speech. remember the whole thing about the disgusting, racist, anti-Muslim cartoons that were originally published by Charlie Hebdo. France is now basically, forcing school children to look at these cartoons, and if they flinch, or if they express any kind of qualms about this, punishing them. Of course, there were the recent horrific attacks, the killing of the French schoolteacher Samuel Paty, who had shown these cartoons in his class, and then there was the attack on the church in Nice. But what is notable about the attackers, one was an 18-year-old who had recently come from Chechnya, who killed Samuel Paty, and the accused person in the attack on the church in Nice had come from Tunisia very recently, within the past few months, had come from Tunisia via Italy. Neither of these guys were from French Muslim communities, but what Macron is doing is using these horrific attacks as as sort of the pretext to wage all-out war, demonizing and dehumanizing the 6 or 7 million French citizens who are Muslim. And I want to read you a passage from an article by Joseph Meshad, the Columbia University professor you've had on your show, talking about what Napoleon did to the Jews in the early 1800s. It's just a couple of paragraphs, but it's I think so important to understand this history of anti-Semitism in France. And Meshad writes, it should be remembered that in 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte convened an assembly of Jewish notables and interrogated them about their religious beliefs and traditions, including polygamy, divorce, marriage with Christians, to ensure that they could become citizens equal to French Christians. He demanded that Jews denounce their own traditions and cross-examine them based on his perception of alleged Jewish separatism and national disloyalty in order to assess whether they would be loyal French citizens and if they would defend France and obey its laws. The Jewish notables formed a council and assured Napoleon in their response that Jewish life and Judaism are fully compatible with French values, as all aspects of Judaism and Jewish life that would be incompatible had already been purged from the community, including polygamy. They also emphasized that a Jew is required to consider the land of his birth or adoption as his fatherland and shall love and defend it when called upon. This submission to Napoleon did not save French Jews from ongoing anti-Semitism and continued through the Dreyfus Affair at the end of the 19th century and the Vichy government during World War II, let alone from the ongoing anti-Semitism of today's racist right wing in France. Now, Macron is doing a carbon copy repeat of what Napoleon did to the Jews. Just in the last 2 weeks, Macron convened sort of the top French Muslim leaders, the heads of various Muslim organizations, and told them, you have 2 weeks to come up with a new Muslim charter of Republican values, so-called Republican values, which affirms that Islam is compatible with French Republican values, that affirms that Islam is only a religion and can have nothing to do with politics. Basically, he's banning so-called political Islam. And they have to come up with a scheme to license imams. So whereas French laïcité or secularism is supposed to be about state neutrality and state distance from religion, what Macron is doing is creating a state Islam which is regulated and licensed by the state, where you're not even allowed to preach. You know, in the United States, freedom of religion means anyone can preach their faith. In France, you will have to have a license to preach Islam, and Islam is the only religion that is being targeted in this way. And of course, if Muslims refuse, then they will be punished by the state. Macron has basically said that. He said, if they refuse, then we'll see what we'll do. And in the meantime, the French government has moved to shut down Muslim civil society organizations and charities, including CCIF, which is the main organization that tracks Islamophobia in France. With no pretext, CCIF is not accused of any crime. And ironically, the person sort of leading on this is the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, who is under judicial investigation for rape and sexual harassment against 2 women. These accusations date from 2009, but the case is ongoing. And when the case was reopened recently, because there was a previous judge who had closed it and then it was reopened, Darmanin said that he insists on his right to a presumption of innocence, which is totally fair. But Muslims and Muslim organizations in France are not being given a presumption of innocence. Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, Robert Spencer, Daniel Pipes, all of these right-wing Islamophobia industry fanatics in the United States can only dream of doing a fraction of what Emmanuel Macron is doing to Muslims in France in broad daylight with almost total silence from the so-called civilized and liberal world.
I want to play a short excerpt from The Grey Zone. The Grey Zone went to Venezuela, and Nicolas Maduro has been elected, from what I understand, after the coup with Juan Guaido, US-backed coup, and a couple of assassination attempts now. Even just on the day of the election, there was an assassination attempt lined up that was uncovered and was going to be held at a polling booth, and it was by somebody in Colombia who was going to carry that out, and I'm sure the US is involved in that somewhere. But fortunately, they found out about that plan, and they went to a different polling booth. So anyway, there are a number of people who are voting on the day in Venezuela, and the Grey Zone, Anya Parampil and Max Blumenthal, they interview on the ground in Venezuela, and it's really great that Bolivia now managed to get in again after that awful US-backed coup. They managed to get in the movement for socialism, the movement towards socialism, and now Venezuela has managed to oust Juan Guaido, the self-appointed neoliberal US puppet, and now they hopefully can rebuild again in Venezuela. I mean, these are crippling US sanctions continue, and over 40,000 Venezuelans now have died since 2017 from these US crippling sanctions. Economic sanctions are an act of war, as you would know. So Nicolas Maduro has his work cut out for him, but I'm sure that because Nicolas Maduro has been so far for the people. He has his problems, but he's been for the people and wanting to do things for the people and use Venezuela's resources for the people. Imagine that. Imagine wanting to use your own country's resources for the people. That's something the US empire does not accept, does not understand, does not accept, and will not allow in any country that has not submitted to the US empire. So that's one reason that places, countries like Bolivia and Venezuela are always in the crosshairs and will continue to be in the crosshairs of US empire until they succumb, and hopefully they won't. Hopefully they will continue on, and there will always be these socialist-leaning or socialist countries, because that's what we need in the world, because end-stage capitalism is just a death drive. It's an ecocide, and it needs to end.
Standing behind me at a polling center in Petare, a working-class neighborhood in Caracas, Venezuela, are Venezuelans who the U.S. government, its allies, and the vast majority of Western media claim don't really exist, because they've shown up to participate in their parliamentary elections, a vote which the United States and its allies have already declared to be fraudulent. If that's the case, we came here to ask people why they're participating in the vote and what they have to say in response to those allegations.
Bueno, estoy participando porque esto es una expresión de un pueblo vivo que está aquí, emocionado y tratando de demostrar al mundo que somos libres y somos soberanos. Por eso es que estamos aquí, demostrando el sentimiento de un pueblo. Así que bueno, los invito a todos que sigan y vengan, que estos centros de votación, hasta que no vote el último, no vamos a cerrar.
El fraude está allá en Norteamérica, que se pongan de acuerdo para ver quién fue quien ganó las elecciones en Norteamérica. Pero aquí a las 9, 10 de la noche, Venezuela, los venezolanos y las venezolanas vamos a saber quién ganó las elecciones en su circuito. Aquí no, este es un proceso muy transparente, este CNE es muy legal, hay que reconocerlo, que lo han reconocido como el presidente de Norteamérica, se me olvidó el nombre ahorita, que lo han reconocido, que este es uno de los mejores procesos en Venezuela, hay uno de los mejores procesos.
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter se evaluó muy bien este proceso. Y este proceso es así, desde hace 20 años, cuando aquí se automatizó, el proceso ha salido muy bien claro, es muy limpio. Aquí cuando la oposición ha ganado, ha ganado, se le ha reconocido su triunfo. En menos de un minuto han salido nuestros presidentes a decir quién ganó.
Nosotros aquí decidimos y la mejor forma de decidir es votando, por eso estamos votando. Nosotros no nos inmiscuimos en nada de lo que hace Estados Unidos. Estados Unidos tiene más de 15 días que hubo elecciones y todavía en verdad no se sabe quién fue el que ganó. Nosotros esta noche, seguramente el Consejo Nacional Electoral va a decir quiénes fueron los diputados que ganaron. Entonces nosotros contentos, esto es una fiesta electoral para nosotros. Invitamos a todo el que no haya votado que venga a votar y estamos, bueno, felices porque esta es la votación número 25 que hacemos en nuestro país y siempre para nosotros ha sido una fiesta electoral.
Creo que para que el gobierno estadounidense opine que hay un fraude en Venezuela, tienen que verse primero ellos dentro con sus elecciones para poder opinar sobre la nuestra. Porque yo creo que más fraude que el que se comete en Estados Unidos no puede haber. Las elecciones nuestras son más legales y aquí se visualiza, viendo al pueblo votar todos los días, votar en esta elección normal, y aquí ustedes lo ven, cómo vienen y votan normal. Yo creo que eso, mejor que eso no hay ninguna cosa.
Yo considero que los Estados Unidos, que es un país desarrollado, siempre tiene una ofensiva para los demás países que ellos los consideran inútiles e incapaces de hacer una elección como la que se está haciendo ahorita, que la gente acurre sin presión, sin ninguna fuerza externa que le diga tienes que votar porque si no, no comes o algo así. Y entonces la gente ocurre perfecto y se vive esta fiesta que se está viviendo aquí electoral, donde no se escucha problema, no se escucha nada, todo está tranquilo y la gente vota. Fraude no creo que haya porque nosotros estamos acostumbrados a votar. Todos los años se hace una elección y siempre han dicho que es un fraude antes de la elección, pero nunca han demostrado ni una prueba siquiera que hubo fraude y siempre quedan igualitos. En cambio, si vamos a las elecciones de los Estados Unidos, ya hace más de 2 meses que hicieron las elecciones y todavía Trump cantó fraude y a este momento todavía no ha presentado ninguna prueba y allá todavía no se sabe quién es el presidente.